Welcome to all. Today is the 24th of February 2023, which marks exactly 1 year, a sad 1 year anniversary since the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Today's EIPA, European Institute of Public Administration, session is dedicated to trying to take stock of the situation after 1 year, in particular from the perspective of the EU's response to the invasion, and that covers quite a huge range of issues. I will be your host for today's session. My name is Igor Dizdarevic. As you can see, I specialize in EU law and work as a lecturer at EIPA for a number of years. So, like I said, we're going to be trying to, in a very limited amount of time, to cover a wide range of issues. So, what are those issues? Well, you might have followed that recently there's been some, and when I say recently, it's literally yesterday, there has been some discussions in the EU about a new package of sanctions, the 10th package of sanctions. So there's the issue of economic sanctions against Russia, economic sanctions taken by the EU and all the 27 member states. That's not the only issue. There is the question of the status of Ukraine vis-à-vis the accession to the European Union. So the question of enlargement, becoming potentially a member of the European Union. And that extends not only to Ukraine, but also to some other countries such as Moldova, for instance. Apart from the enlargement, there is another outstanding issue, which is the question of energy supply and the strategic autonomy of the European Union. And finally, let's not forget also the human side of it and the question of the refugees and the flow of refugees coming from Ukraine into the territory of EU member states. So in order to explore all those topics, I'll be joined by three members of the panel. I'm very grateful that they are here with us today. We will be looking into the question of sanctions and the question of enlargement with my colleague Wolfgang Kurth. So thank you very much for joining us online. We will be then looking into the macroeconomics, basically, and the situation, the economic situation in Russia and Ukraine, together with Marek Dabrowski, whom I'm very much grateful that he is today with us. Dr. Dabrowski is a non-resident scholar at Bruegel, co-founder and fellow at CASE, which is the Center for Social and Economic Research in Warsaw, and also a visiting professor at the Central European University in Vienna. And more importantly, I would say, Marek has more than 30 years of experience in the entire region. So thank you very much. And finally, my third panelist will be my colleague Catherine Varin, who is also a fellow lecturer at the European Institute of Public Administration, and she specializes in questions related to asylum and migration. So thank you very much for joining. As I said, we are having a relatively limited amount of time. I would like, just as a matter of illustration, to highlight one of the biggest overarching problems that are caused by the invasion of Ukraine. And that is namely the question of energy supply, strategic autonomy of the EU vis-à-vis foreign supply of energy. This has always been an objective for a number of years, that the EU would reach the strategic autonomy with regards to energy supply. But we went from something that was a mid-term or long-term objective to basically something being the objective for next Monday, that we have to basically be energy independent very, very quickly. This raises a number of questions which are related to the increase in the share of renewable energies. It is related to the increase in the energy efficiency, so reducing energy consumption at EU level, all of which should contribute, in particular under the Green Deal currently, should contribute to the EU being independent from energy supply. Emergency actions have been taken. It has been referred to as a sprint, let's say. Emergency actions have been taken, and in particular last year, an obligation which was fulfilled for the member states to actually fill their reserves of natural gas up to 80 and even 90% in the view of the winter. Now, it is also true that part of the EU's success in dealing with this was down to favorable circumstances, such as an actual mild winter, but nevertheless, the issue remains for next winter. So this is, and allow me to already share with you a bit of a bibliography. There is a very good summary briefing by the European Parliament's Research Service, which is available here. I'm putting it in the link in the chat, a link in the chat, which summarizes very much the situation and refers to the need from sprinting to going full marathon, because this is a long-term issue. So there is a number of statistics and data that can be found there, and in particular the question of how drastically imports from Russia have been reduced with regards to coal, oil, and basically natural gas, and this has to be replaced. This is quite a challenge for the EU, because the EU has a competence actually to act with regards to energy. It is a shared competence, which means that both member states and the EU can act, with one nuance there, which is that the EU has no say over the choice of the energy mix of the member states, which is why one of the challenges, one of the things we have been witnessing since the beginning of this invasion was the fact that different member states have different energy mixes, and therefore that leads to different decisions. France relies somewhat on nuclear power, Germany does not. That raises different questions in terms of how member states get their supplies. But the EU is acting. In particular, there's a wave of revisions now currently under the Green Deal with regards to climate change objectives and energy union. And in particular, there's a revision of the Energy Renewables Directive with new targets. And there's a revision of the Energy Efficiency Directive also with new targets. We should add to that there is financing being available for green projects and energy savings, in particular, for example, for buildings, for new buildings, but also renovating the stock of old buildings. There's actually a specific directive currently being revised on the energy performance of buildings. So the energy union is this one example of the challenges ahead of us. Now, it has to do also, of course, and here we come to our first topic, it has to do, of course, with sanctions. Sanctions consist of, well, cutting imports from Russia of sources of energy, of oil, of gas, and therefore that triggers also an even more urgent need for energy efficiency, increase of energy increase of the share of the energy renewables, and so on and so forth. So that leads me actually to this question of sanctions, and let's have a look at where we are. We can remember from 2022, when the invasion began, we had this discussion very early on the 24th of March last year. That was a 1-month sort of anniversary of the invasion. And already by then, if I remember correctly, we were at the 4th or even 5th package of sanctions against Russia and Belarus as well. So where are we currently with the question of sanctions? What is going on, and how is it even possible? And this is my question to you, Wolfgang, basically. How is it possible that the EU has responded so strongly with unprecedented sanctions, including sanctions that not only target individuals, but also target companies, and on top of that target the Russian central bank by freezing its assets outside of Russia? So how did we reach this, and where do we stand right now from that perspective? So the floor is yours, Wolfgang, please.
Thank you, Igor. And yes, indeed, as you mentioned, I mean, sanctions have become the major instruments for the EU towards Russia, towards this big surprise for everyone was how quickly and how swift the EU was able to adapt big and comprehensive overarching sanctions, and not just the easy kind of sanctions we applied back in 2014, with some travel bans for some of Putin's friends, or some export of or some arms embargoes, some bans on dual-use goods, but really the big comprehensive one, excluding Russia from SWIFT, including freezing the assets of the Russian central banks and other banks, including the overflight bans for Russian planes, prohibition for Russian planes to land in the EU. So a huge array of sanctions have been taken not in months, not in weeks, but within days. And that is really, yes, amazing and surprising. If you look at other examples where the EU has adopted sanctions in the past against Iran, against North Korea, against Venezuela, it took sometimes years to agree on them. We might remember in 2020 when the EU was proposing to impose some bans on Belarus after Lukashenko cracked down on the opposition. That took weeks because one member state representing 0.2% of the EU population blocked everything. And here now within days, or even less days, because the first package of sanctions was brought about one day, basically after the 24th of February, after the Russian aggression. All the member states, by unanimity, agreed, including Hungary. And that was just the start, as you mentioned. There has been a second round, a third round. Now we have adopted by now 9 packages of sanctions. A 10th one is about to be adopted, but still has some issues to be sorted out. But this is something that most people would never have thought that this would be possible. Even I have to be honest. I mean, there are some instances where we still struggle to adopt sanctions. For example, we didn't manage to adopt sanctions against the transport of Russian oil by European ships, because some member states which have stakes in this sector have blocked this. Also, some other sanctions, specific sanctions, were blocked. But in general, it's a rather, let's say, positive picture that we managed to agree so swiftly on such big measures. And it's not only the EU sanctions, the autonomous EU sanctions, but also the sanctions have been joined, I would say, by the private sector, because more than 1,000 EU companies have decided to draw out of Russia. And this obviously has a very strong impact. Now, having said this, I think we all are aware that these sanctions didn't make Mr. Putin change his mind, that he didn't adopt his behavior accordingly. But to be honest, nobody expected him to do so. And this is not what sanctions are there for. Sanctions are not there to produce very quick results. They take a long time to show effects, and very often you can't break down the effects, you can't attribute the effect concretely to specific sanctions, because sanctions are just one part of the EU's policy tools. They have to be accompanied by other measures, but still they're the most powerful policy tool the EU has. Only if not for producing direct effects, also as a strong symbol of European unity, European solidarity towards Ukraine, and also as a strong deterrent. A strong deterrent to other countries that might be tempted to use similar means as Russian for pursuing their own policy goals. I think these countries will now think twice before before repeating what Mr. Putin has done in Russia. So maybe I stop here and hand back to
It's
you.
very
Igor.
interesting. I mean, let me just unpack a little bit. First, the first element, I think, and you said it, is how quickly it was done, and I think we can remind everyone that we're talking about a policy area of the EU which is historically relatively not very strong, let's say. It's the common foreign and security policy, which requires basically unanimity. And we had it for now almost 10 packages. So that's quite a remarkable achievement. Yes, there's also the international coordinators for sanctions. So it's being done also in cooperation with sorry, third countries. And I think you're very right in you probably very right, because we don't know yet, about the deterrent effect, because probably China might be thinking twice now before potentially invading Taiwan, at least physically. So I think that's quite a remarkable achievement, even though you're absolutely right, Mr. Putin has not changed his mind. I had, in preparing this session, I was actually already talking a bit with Marek, and Marek was having a very interesting short remark that sanctions cannot substitute actually a military response, but that's what we're seeking. We don't want to engage into a direct war with Russia. It's interesting that actually this, from the Russian perspective, that it is being justified as some sort of expansion of NATO towards the eastern part. That brings me to my other question. Has now this situation led to an increased likelihood of Ukraine becoming a fully fledged member state of the EU? So you are an enlargement expert, so you tell me.
Well, increased likelihood and in combination with enlargement is a dangerous combination, because enlargement, in the EU's enlargement policy, if you have followed it up over the last 2 decades, it's pretty unpredictable policy. So I would be a little bit careful here in choosing my words. However, I mean, what has happened here in the field of enlargement and with regards to Ukraine, that we have seen a sea change. Now, keep in mind that the accession to the European Union, what has been on top of Ukraine's policy agenda for 2 decades. For 2 decades, they wanted from the EU accession perspective. And for 2 decades, the EU said, no, sorry, we do not even consider you a potential candidate for accession, as they considered Kosovo or others. No, we do not even let you in the EU's waiting room. So you stay where you are in the neighborhood, and the enlargement, basically the enlargement zone has been established. It's with the Western Balkan and Turkey, and that's it. And that has changed a few days after the Russian invasion. In early March, the European Council, the heads of state and of government, by unanimity agreed to give an enlargement perspective to Ukraine. And that was really a sea change. So a completely different approach, which was followed by another decision of the European Council in June to actually give Ukraine the status of a candidate country. The accession perspective and the fact that Ukraine is a candidate country doesn't really mean that Ukraine will be a member of the EU in 10 or even 20 years, because that depends entirely of the political will of the EU member states. So one thing is that Ukraine has to do certain reforms. Ukraine has to adopt the acquis, the Copenhagen criteria. That's all for granted. So don't believe 1 nanosecond. I don't believe 1 nanosecond in these talks about an accelerated accession path that Ukraine can become a member within 1 or 2 years. No, absolutely not, because there is a method, a process. There's 170,000 pages of EU legislation legislation and rules to be adopted. But the biggest hurdle in enlargement is this unanimous vote by the member states, not only at the very last stage to let Ukraine in, but in fact at every single of these dozens of technical steps that have to be taken until then. At every single step, there has to be a unanimous decision on by the member states. For example, for opening and closing one of the 35 chapters and so. So this depends entirely on the political will of the member states, but now the political will is there. And this is what has changed to with regards to before February 24. Now we have realized that this is not only a question of let's say the Ukraine becoming part of the internal market of the Schengen zone. This is a question of geopolitical importance, because and that shows us also that enlargement policy is above all foreign policy. It's about exporting our norms and values to other other countries. It is bringing Ukraine close to the European Union, also to exporting security and stability to Ukraine. So here, that is the second sea change we have seen, and I think there are more sea changes in the EU, and probably my colleagues will talk about these, but enlargement is one of them.
Well, I think I agree with you. I mean, I was a bit provocative saying an accelerated procedure for Ukraine. I think one of the arguments, apart from the fact that enlargement is a lengthy process, like a simple one to Croatia took nearly 10 years, I think, and that was considered relatively fast. But by those standards, definitely not. But it is a game changer that we move from denying even potential candidate status to granting full candidate status in a matter of days after the invasion. I think also it's a sensitive issue politically vis-a-vis the other candidate countries. If Ukraine were to somehow enter the EU all of a sudden, and you have Montenegro, Bosnia, Serbia in the waiting line for a number of years already. I think the question of this status, candidate status and enlargement is also very much linked to the EU's policy with regards to the status given to refugees and Ukrainian citizens who are fleeing and going to the EU. We will come back to that issue with Catherine in a minute, but still linking the sanctions and the economic situation, I'd like to turn to Marek now and ask you basically, what is your view? What is the current situation in Russia? I know a lot of data is not available or is not certain, but tell us a little bit what your position is, and what do you think that maybe sanctions had an effect on the economy, or maybe we can't really measure it?
First, thank you for inviting me to this webinar. What I can say today is based mostly on Russian statistics of Central Statistical Agency, Rosstat, Ministry of Finance, Central Bank of Russia. Unfortunately, we don't have yet IMF or World Bank data for 2022. It's a picture which we can obtain from the statistics looks pretty good for the Russian economy. Russian GDP declined by 2.1% last year, which is less than in COVID 2020 year. It's approximately the same as in 2015 after the radical decline in oil prices and also the first wave of Western sanctions against Russia. It's definitely less than during the global financial crisis 2008-2009. Inflation is higher than it was before the war, but it's, I would say, moderate by Russian historical standards is 11.8%. Federal deficit of federal budget, as reported by Federal Ministry of Finance, is minus 2.3%. We don't have still a complete picture, meaning extra budgetary funds and regional budgets. So we must wait a while for complete picture. Again, this is worse than, for example, 2021 or other years, especially given the high oil prices. And as Russian sources, Russian Ministry of Finance confirms that in absolute terms, it means in ruble value, this is the second largest federal budget deficit after 2020 COVID. But still, I would say it's not dramatic. Minus 2.3% of GDP as compared to many other countries doesn't. Even if finally we'll have to add 1 percentage point, it still will not be dramatic. But what is very important, situation is deteriorating. The first half of year was very positive for budget, and it was also very positive for balance of payments, largely to very high oil prices. And as we know, oil prices started to decline, plus also there is some effect of sanction, but practically this effect existed from the very beginning of the war, meaning some discount for the Ural crude oil price, which is in the range of 15% of the Texas, for example, of Brent price. And this both prices are going down. So the budget situation in the second half of the year was worse and is going worse. And what is so I would say that this is the weakest point of the Russian economy and the potential source of some macroeconomic turbulence, fiscal situation. What is the reason of this deteriorating fiscal accounts? Even deterioration is still moderate by international comparison. First, I would say that there are cost of war, military cost and non-military cost, or cost of social programs related to keeping some sort of social peace within Russia. I would say, social expenditures related to war will probably increase if we take for granted promises which President Putin made 3 days ago in his annual address. There were quite many such promises. So this is probably the main reason of this deterioration. And of course also cost of some form of supporting the occupied Ukrainian territories. Even if the situation is dramatic on this territory, still there are some expenditures which must be covered. What is the role of sanction? I am not specialist of sanction, but my understanding is that first, that financial sanctions, which were mentioned by Wolfgang, and including those which were historically unprecedented, like freezing approximately half of the Russian international reserves, or cutting off most of Russian major banks from SWIFT system. They didn't create financial turmoil or financial crisis as some expected. Why? First, Russian authorities prepared themselves since 2014 for escalation of confrontation with the West. So, for example, they created national payment system, national payment card system, etc., which immunize them to a certain extent from sanctions. Second, I think this was very, very professional management, central bank and Ministry of Finance management during the first weeks and months of the war. So of course, sometimes using very drastic measures like practically eliminating capital account convertibility, also limiting current account convertibility. Then this restriction were somewhat relaxed in the second half of the year, but this eliminated historically the main factor of repeated Russian financial crisis, so capital outflow, capital flight, which happened usually in 1998, 1999, 2008, 2009, 2014, 15, 2020. Whenever any kind of adverse shock occurs, non-residents and the residents flight out of Russia. So basically, this factor was eliminated. There is also, I must say, quite a lot evidence about, I would say, moderate circumventing of sanction via countries which didn't join sanction, like Turkey, like Kazakhstan, to some extent China, India, regarding the oil export, using some black fleet of tankers created before sanction became effective in Emirates, etc. Still, Russia is losing due to this discount which I mentioned, but export is going on. So, in my view, as far as the sanctions are not global, unfortunately, we must expect even more circumventing because, for example, looking from other sectors, which were dependent, for example, of importing some critical components or critical materials, which were banned by another part of sanction. It's a lot of evidence that Russian enterprises work out some new ways of importing, again, via Kazakhstan, via Turkey, sometimes from China, sometimes from other Asian countries. Or basically, we must remember that this is only G7 plus countries like Australia, South Korea, or New Zealand which joined the sanction. Practically most of largest emerging market economy, China, India, Indonesia, Brazil, Turkey, they didn't join sanction or joined them only partially. So here we have a huge hole, and we must be aware of this limitation. Finally, I can say that obviously sanctions are not, I would say, neutral. They have adverse effect, as the 2014 sanction had, but this is a rather long-term effect. This is deteriorating growth perspective, which were already weak before. Why? Because of demographic situation of Russia, and also because of some deterioration of domestic business investment climate, more stronger role of state, renationalization of some sectors, etc., etc. Very, very hostile attitude of law enforcement agencies to business, etc. So this various kind of bans of export technologies or some critical components to Russia, they will have definitely negative impact on a medium to long-term growth. So this is, I would say, the picture which I can present today.
Right. Thank you. So just let me get this right. So what you're saying is that currently, first of all, that they started preparing themselves way before. And this is indeed the crisis that started in 2014. And you're also saying that the weakest spot in the Russian economy is basically the fiscal one. So the budget deficits. But that comes from a variety of causes. It's not just sanctions. It's maybe somewhat the sanctions, but it's also the cost of the war. So cost of the social policy with regards to that, and cost of maintaining in Ukraine, in the occupied territories.
And my prediction is that this cost will increase rapidly in 2023, assuming that war is continued. But I think that this cost of war, for obvious reasons, will increase, maybe increase dramatically. Regarding the revenue side, this will depend very much on the situation on global oil market, because oil rent is the main source of revenue federal budget. It was always like that. Gas plays a less important role, plus Russian counter-sanction or countermeasure against Europe practically killed most of the natural gas exports. So here, federal budget cannot expect any significant revenues. And let's say that probably very much will depend on the global economic activity. First, whether China, which have very energy-intensive economy, will recover after all this COVID-related restriction, which were recently abandoned, and how other economies will perform. If I would say advanced economies plus China, they recover quickly, then it may perhaps oil prices will grow again, and this will provide some respite to the Russian budget. If the current prices will continue to decline or will remain on this level, Russia will face some important constraint.
Right, and that's interesting, because we tend to present everything through the angle of the EU sanctions, but there was also counter sanctions, as you said, which looks a little bit like shooting themselves in the foot in a way, because
they would exactly. But this is tradition of Russian foreign policy. I would say reciprocity. The same was in 2014, introducing a ban on the import of food import from US, Canada, etc., which basically made quite a lot bad for Russian consumers, who had to pay more for other import, alternative import. But this is another non-economic debate. I would say the entire drama comes from, in my perception, overestimation of geopolitical potential posture of Russian authorities, which continue to feel like the full rival of United States and NATO at par, what is not the case.
Right. Let me ask you just, but very quickly, because time is flying, let me just ask you, what is the current situation in Ukraine? What's the economic situation in Ukraine? Because I think they have negative figures, very impressive.
Here, situation is really dramatic. Again, preliminary figures are that GDP in 2022 declined more than 30%, 32, 33. This probably will get more detailed figures in the coming weeks. Then budget, national budget of Ukraine is really very, very high. I don't have exact figures. I have figures in hryvnia, but not in terms of GDP yet. This is despite large foreign grants, first instance US grants, then European Union grants, which consider approximately, I think, 1/3 of the in the current situation of revenue Ukrainian budget. There is expectation that at least yesterday I participated in another webinar organized by one of the Ukrainian economic centers in Kiev, and they presented, I would say, moderately optimistic pictures that Ukrainian economy reached already the bottom, and now the coming months will be some recovery. What I would say, it's possible under conditions that the war will not be dramatically escalated, because of course the economy, it requires some time to reorganize economic management to the war situation, and I think this has been already done. So now is the chance that reallocation of some industries, etc., etc. So now I think that there is chance for some sort of moderate recovery, but this is very conditional on the military developments, also other developments, whether Russia will respect agreement on exporting Ukrainian wheat and other agriculture project via Black Sea, etc. So regarding other indicators, inflation in Ukraine reached 26%. This is preliminary figure in 2020. International reserve of National Bank of Ukraine are very high, but largely due to external assistance. So net reserves are probably negative. Here I'm not fully sure. Exchange rate is very rigidly administratively managed since beginning of the war. So we had multiple exchange rate. Official rate is, after some devaluation this summer, is now around 36 hryvnia for $1. Market rates is somewhere between 40 and 42. So there is substantial premium on black market premium. By the way, the same is also, but a bit smaller in case of Russia, because of the also restriction exchange rate foreign exchange restriction in Russia, which I mentioned before. So this is more or less I would say aggregate picture of Ukrainian economy. Regarding individual sectors, we have some information. Of course, sectors which were are on occupied territories, on the or frontline territories, they suffer a lot, like metallurgy, for example, or coal production and other heavy industry, which were located mostly in Donbass, on southeast Ukraine, Zaporozhye region, or Kherson region, which are still partly occupied, and even if some parts, for example, of Kherson itself was reconquested by Ukrainian army. But on the other hand, there is also some evidence that there are some sectors which expanded their production, especially for the army needs, like food industry or cloth, light industry, which before largely disappeared. Now they need to supply army. But again, I think that we must wait for another few weeks to have a full picture of 2022.
Sure. It's worth noting also for our audience that the plan from the EU side is that the Russian funds that are frozen because of the sanctions would be actually used to partly to finance the reconstruction in Ukraine. Thank you very much. We're going to, time is limited, as I said, so we're going to be moving to another question to the issue of migration. But before that, there is a question from the audience. There is one from Mike Burnett. Does the panel think that the recent collective actions on energy will lead to a common energy policy similar to the Common Agricultural Policy, the CAP. Well, I'm no expert in the agricultural policy, but I would certainly say that it goes towards the objective of establishing an energy union, and in particular an internal market for energy. So in a sense, it almost goes beyond the Common Agricultural Policy already, which is mostly subsidies essentially. So it aims at establishing an energy union, and that's why in particular what is currently being done is a revision of the third electricity directive and the revision of the legislation on gas markets. And this goes hand in hand with this decarbonized gas in line with the Green Deal and the climate objectives. So that's certainly on its way. How fast will it go? Well, the invasion of Ukraine has changed everything because it has given definitely a push towards having this not even common energy policy, but really having an energy union. So going to the highest level of integration that we know at the EU level, which is the internal market. So you imagine there's free movement of goods, free movement of services, etc. And then in the energy sector, you have exactly the same. And one of the things that has been done is in particular to accelerate the interconnection of electricity grids across the EU. There was actually a plan before the invasion to do that with Ukraine as well. So to interconnect Ukraine with the energy grids from the EU. So this is definitely part of the top priorities of the current Commission, and will undoubtedly also be the case for the next Commission. There's a second question from Cecilia concerning, and I think this is concerning Russia's frozen assets. I understand they cannot be confiscated as such, but could they be invested to generate revenue as the Commission proposed? What could be the major difficulties in doing so? I guess this would be for Marek, maybe. Marek, do you want to address the issue of frozen assets?
Well, I am not a lawyer, and I understand that there's quite many problems to confiscate these assets, and there are also some, I would say, economic considerations that doing so would undermine the global role of reserve currencies such as US dollar or euro, that it may discourage other countries from using this currency So this is, I have problems now to comment what is here possible. Definitely keeping them frozen, it may be argument with negotiation, post-war negotiation about reconstruction, reparation of something like this, depending what will appear after war. But because I think that's realistically looking, this will be possible only in the current political regime in Russia change. This kind of negotiation can happen. Otherwise, we can think, I think, only about some sort of ceasefire, like 2015 and after Minsk agreement. I would, I don't want to abuse my time limit, but I would like in this context say one thing. Definitely, I think that now much more important is to provide Ukraine not only with military assistance, massive military assistance, because this is absolutely key to defending Ukraine and also indirectly influence political situation in Russia if Russian army is not able to achieve its political goals in Ukraine, but also another type of assistance which is badly needed. This is financial assistance. Let's say less about post-war reconstruction because war is still going. We don't know what are total war losses, what concretely will be needed, etc. But it's definitely Ukrainian budget in the war situation cannot have this amount of revenue which it had before the war. So much larger financial assistance is absolutely needed. According to IMF estimates, around 96 of something, close to 100 billion of dollars, US dollars, is needed this year to close financial gap of Ukraine. This is absolutely crucial, because otherwise Ukrainian risk not only war failure, but also macroeconomic failure, something like hyperinflation or total economic chaos. So this would be definitely not desirable scenario.
Right. And I think, well, it's definitely, I fully agree that it's a political discussion to be having post-war. With regards to the legal aspects, one could point out at the fact that individuals whose assets are frozen have actual access to justice in the sense that they can go before the Court of Justice of the EU and challenge the freezing of the assets. And we have had previous jurisprudence in that with regards to Kadi, which was a series of cases post 9/11. So if individual assets are frozen, that can be challenged before the court. So that means there's a procedure to undergo. I see Wolfgang is actually typing an answer as well to your question, Cecilia. So while he is typing it, let's give the floor to my colleague Catherine. Catherine, thank you very much for bearing with us. And the question I would like to have your take on is related to refugees and essentially the way the EU has been dealing with it, in particular because we do have a temporary protection directive, which was actually designed for the war in Yugoslavia, former Yugoslavia, and actually was never triggered before the Ukrainian war. So can you tell us a little bit about where we stand with that and what is the current common European asylum system?
Yes, great. So thank you, Igor, and thank you both Wolfgang and Marek for the very interesting explanations. The Temporary Protection Directive indeed is quite an atypical legal instrument in the common European asylum system, because we've had a lot of reforms of this system, or at least attempts to reform the system in the past 20 years. But the Temporary Protection Directive has remained exactly as it initially was, never touched, never used until last year. And so it raises a lot of issues because even though the instrument itself is old, its use is extremely recent. And so it was triggered for the first time when people arrived from Ukraine last year. So the point of this instrument is to provide minimum standards for granting temporary protection in the event of a mass influx of displaced persons. So exactly what we had starting a year ago now. And the purpose is to make sure that the effort is as balanced as possible between member states welcoming those people in need of protection. So this is let's say, the basis. And as I was saying, it needs to be triggered. So the Temporary Protection Directive provides for a mechanism which then needs to be triggered if the member states and the EU agree that there needs to be this kind of protection. So it's very different from the classic refugee international protection setting. And I would like to point out here that exactly like Wolfgang mentioned with regard to the sanctions, it's actually quite remarkable how fast the EU acted to trigger the temporary protection in this case. It had, as I was saying, never been used before in other situations where it might have been relevant. For instance, at the moment where a mass amount of Syrian refugees arrived to the EU, but it was never never on the table. But for the Temporary Protection Directive following the start of the Ukrainian crisis, it was extremely fast. It took just a few days for the Council to unanimously agree that there was a mass influx of displaced persons from Ukraine and to decide to activate the Temporary Protection Directive. And so we have the directive to understand a little bit what it's about, but it's quite vague actually. So we also have to rely to understand how it works on the Council implementing decision, which triggers officially the temporary protection for Ukrainians. And then we have guidelines from the Commission, basically to understand how to apply it in practice. So what the Council decided was to provide temporary protection to Ukrainian nationals, as well as persons who were refugees in Ukraine, and to the family members of those two first categories, but only to, so these three categories, if they were displaced either on or after the 24th of February 2022. So it's not protection for every person arriving from Ukraine at any date. It has to be, so the temporary protection is granted to people who have left Ukraine, who have been displaced really due to the Russian invasion on 24th of February 2022. Just in a nutshell, the protection consists in, so at least 1 year protection. It allows people who are given this protection to access the employment market in the EU member state where they are without a specific permit. There is access to school system for children. There is access to reception conditions, so some form of housing, and some right to family reunification. So it's basic protection. It's meant to be temporary. This is going to be one of the main challenges. It's short term, right? So we might have a problem with this not too far in the not too far future. And yes, we have very limited guidance. We have no Court of Justice guidance on how to apply this. For instance, there is no case law on the Temporary Protection Directive because it has been so recently activated. So basically, we are faced with a variety of practices by member states when it comes to how they actually in practice apply the Temporary Protection Directive. And we have the European Commission trying to coordinate to identify solutions when there are new legal questions that arise. And probably we'll still have several questions to sort out, not the least being what is going to happen when this temporary protection is no longer provided, because so now it will be renewed for an extra year. There is still the possibility after that for 1 year, but then that's it. So this is one of the challenges probably to be addressed. Yeah. I'm just looking at the time, so I don't know, Igor, if you wanted to go into specific.
I mean, like, it's quite clear. I mean, this is still uncharted territory, I think, to a certain extent. But I would say then, what are the current challenges? Like, we are 1 year after it was deployed. What is for the future? How is it influenced by potentially a very long war? So what are the questions? And then I would have maybe a specific questions, because there was a decision at some point in Finland and Estonia, etc., about Russian nationals coming from Russia to those countries, and with a decision not to accept them. So what are the current challenges essentially?
Yes. Okay. So when it comes to temporary protection, so this is only intended for Ukrainians or people who were refugees in Ukraine. So right now it has been granted to almost 4 million people in the EU. But 4 million, yeah. Okay. Which is in fact a lot less than the number of people who have actually fled into the EU from Ukraine. So it means what is happening with these other people. And this is actually one of the challenges that can be highlighted, is a sort of gap that, well, not gap, or perhaps a gap that has been left intentionally in the Council implementing decision, which is what happens to non-Ukrainian nationals who are also fleeing Ukraine. And here, member states have an option to also grant them temporary protection, but they don't have to. So we are seeing in this respect in particular a huge variety of practices from one member state to another. Some of them will go on to address cases on a case-by-case basis. Others will fully refuse to grant temporary protection to non-Ukrainian nationals, even though they are fleeing the Ukrainian conflict. So there is a little bit of confusion and definitely huge variations in how this is being applied. So this is one of the issues. And perhaps connected with this, as I was saying, the Temporary Protection Directive has been kind of left on the side from all the developments that we've had in the Common European Asylum System. And one of those developments in the overall system was to have quite a detailed set of procedures. So how does the administration deal with an asylum application? Then what is the kind of remedy that is open to applicants, etc. For the Temporary Protection Directive, we don't have all that. So there is no formal requirement on the member states to issue, for instance, a written decision. There is basically nothing procedurally speaking. So again, each member state has their own practice. which may translate into difficulties for people who are denied protection to actually challenge the refusal. So there is an issue also in terms of for instance, the right to an effective judicial remedy. These are some of the challenges that can be highlighted. Maybe moving on to your question on Russian nationals. This is it's a very important question because, of course, yes, there are also Russian nationals who may be asking for protection in the EU. Actually, there was also a discussion a few months ago, I think during the summer, about whether it would be lawful to completely ban visas delivered to Russian nationals. And this has been also like a legal discussion, not every lawyer agreeing on the solution. But when it comes to protection, to me, it seems completely impossible to rule out that the possibility for any Russian national to be granted asylum. This seems to be contrary to basic asylum law for the simple reason that assessing an asylum application has to remain an individual process. So everyone has an individual right to seeing their asylum application assessed. So, of course, Russian nationals cannot apply for temporary protection because this is not provided for unless they are a family member of a Ukrainian national, and then that's something else. But for asylum, I don't see how it could be, in principle, excluded. So that would still be a possibility.
Right. Is there any chance that this whole new situation with regards to refugees and temporary protection would lead to future reforms of the asylum system, or is it too complicated politically?
Well, I think it's. There is an attempt to reform the system that is currently on the table, and this is so some of the instruments, the new ones, have actually been adopted. So we have, for instance, we have an EU asylum agency that is now a bit more, that has more resources than what we previously have, the European Asylum Support Office. Other instruments are in the pipes, yes, and one of those is actually a solidarity mechanism in a situation of crisis. And this was actually a regulation that is still a proposal for now, but that was supposed to replace the temporary protection directive. And quite ironically, in fact, because when this regulation was put on the table, the assumption was that the temporary protection directive would just never have been used by the time it went through. So it's possible now that seeing how the temporary protection directive has worked, is working, and also in some instances is perhaps not working so well, that the current proposal for the regulation might be amended based on this experience. That might actually be quite a sensible thing to do, but yeah.
Right, and that's interesting because there's like a number of questions. It's not just about temporary protection of one individual. It's maybe regrouping the family. So a number of issues, and also the question of you can be non-Ukrainian and yet be fleeing from the war in Ukraine. Is it that in Luxembourg there was some confusion in the beginning, or some differences in treatment which possibly could amount to some sort of discrimination?
Yes, so I think it's not actually only in Luxembourg that this was noted as an issue, but there were also reports from people being blocked at the border, basically because at the border crossing from Ukraine into the EU, for instance, into Poland, basically because they did not look Ukrainian. So that is something that was reported on, so not specific to Luxembourg. But so first there is this very, there is basically the visual obstacle that, that arises already at the crossing of the border initially. But then the temporary protection mechanism is indeed intended for Ukrainians primarily, and then their family members, and Ukrainians themselves may be of different ethnicities. So this, in principle, the ethnicity itself should not be an issue. But yes, for third country nationals who are not Ukrainian and who are perhaps, so several of them were from Africa, either North Africa or Sub-Saharan Africa countries, they have been in several member states, and this includes Luxembourg. They were denied temporary protection and very often left without a clear alternative. So basically, it was, since you don't fulfill the criteria for temporary protection, you have to go back to your home country. And which actually is not always possible, meaning that ideally, someone who gets refused temporary protection should at least be put in the position to claim another status or to try another procedure, perhaps the classic asylum procedure, for instance. And this has been quite, in practice, has proved quite difficult in several member states. Just to develop a little bit on the Luxembourgish example, there was another issue, but again, probably not specific to one member state, but just because I have the example in mind. The temporary protection scheme provides that people have to be housed or given housing. And this creates tensions in the rest of the common European asylum system, because it means a new influx of persons who will have to be housed in facilities that were designed for other kinds of refugees. So the classic refugees, let's say. So this is not, of course, not only a legal issue, but actually a question of the material resources that need to be provided. Yeah.
Right. Thank you very much. We have I'm inviting in the last few minutes, if anyone from the audience wants to ask additional questions, now is the moment. We've had an additional question which Wolfgang has, well, he's answered actually both, but he's answered the second question about frozen assets in regards to some recent judgments from Swiss courts. I'm in agreement with Wolfgang's answer, and I would add to that there is most likely I'm not familiar with the Swiss case in particular, but most likely the problem would be also that many countries constitutionally protect the right to own property, and therefore freezing or worse, confiscating assets then reusing them, etc., would be contrary to the, let's say, Swiss constitutional requirement to defend the right of property, the right to own property. So that would be my, just to complement Wolfgang's answer. And then you probably had some replica or mirror provisions in the investment protection agreement between Switzerland and Russia. Right, so we have exceeded by nine minutes or the time allocated, so we're going to be concluding for today. I'd like to thank everyone for joining in, and in particular Marek, Wolfgang and Catherine for entertaining this discussion. I hope it was interesting. The recording will be available on the YouTube channel of EIPA. So thank you very much.